Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all our members and attendees, and thank you for joining us for today's CISA webinar. We appreciate your continued engagement and support. Today's session is focusing on Practice Notes 106, which is a new one, which is the overview of the 2025 ECSA guideline scope of services and professional fees, as published in the Gazette number 52691 on the 16th of May 2025. The document will be reviewed and important changes from previous versions of the guideline will be highlighted and explained. By way of context, CISA Practice Notes serve as a practical guidance document aimed at supporting consulting engineers in South Africa to operate efficiently, ethically, and in alignment with industry best practice. They play an important role in enhancing consistency, managing risk, and protecting both service providers and their clients. To access CISA Practice Notes, members may visit our website at www.cisa.co.za. Under the Guidelines tab, you will find the relevant resources. As this is a member service, access is restricted to member companies only. However, should you be a member company and want to get access to these practice notes, please don't hesitate to contact Gillian at gillian@cisa.co.za. That's Gillian. And she will gladly assist you with a smile on her face. The contact details will also be shared in the chat during the session. A brief background on the practice notes. They originated in 1962, advisory notes, and were rebranded in 2012. Over time, they have expanded significantly, and more than 100 notes are now available, covering a broad spectrum of professional and business-related topics. The practice notes are structured across 6 key areas: client and appointment, construction stage services, good business practice, legal responsibility and disputes, professional conduct and development, and finally, quality and risk management. We also encourage members to provide feedback on existing practice notes. Should you identify areas requiring an update or refinement due to industry development, please feel free to contact me at Oliver, that's Oliver @cisa.co.za. I'll put this in the chat as well, so that these can be reviewed by our professional team. This professional team is meeting shortly, so the sooner you do it, the sooner we can get onto those for you. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping matters. Please submit any questions under the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to share comments via the chat. And I will monitor both of these during the discussion. Now, let me take this opportunity to welcome our guest speaker for today's webinar. Our speaker is Craig Clark. Craig Clark is a professional registered mechanical engineer with over 50 years experience in the consulting engineering profession. His career included a wide range of mechanical engineering building services, and he specializes in fire engineering. He was the managing director of a firm and was on the CISA Council for many years, becoming president of CISA in 2003-2004. His career exposed him to a very broad spectrum of the consulting engineering profession and the construction industry in general. Since his retirement from his firm, Craig has remained active in CISA affairs and sits on several committees. He has played a leading role in the review and updating of various standard form contracts for both professional services and construction. Craig has been involved in various roles with the annual review of ECSA guidelines for more than 25 years and has a deep understanding of the document. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Craig to begin today's presentation. Craig, over to you.
Thank you very much for that rather flattering introduction, which I'm not sure that it's justified, but anyway, I'll do my best. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and I hope you're going to enjoy listening to the presentation. Sorry, you can now see the presentation, I hope. I'll dive in straight away. So we're going to look at an overview of the 2025 EXA guideline. The 2025 document introduced quite a few updates and let's call them improvements and changes from previous versions. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to take us through the 2025 document, and where there are changes, I will talk about them. Unfortunately, I think I've got about 45 minutes to talk, and I could really sit here all day talking about the guideline and going into the detail of it. So it is very much an overview, but hopefully it will give you enough information to get a proper understanding of the document. And as Oliver said, please do not hesitate to put any queries or points of clarification into the chat, and I'll do my best at the end of the presentation to answer you. So if we go without any further ado into the document, and the first slide here shows the basic contents of the EXA guideline. And this is terribly important because you need to understand that the guideline consists of two main sections. First of all, of course, there's a preamble and definitions and some general provisions, but then part 3 or clause 3 of the guideline deals with the scope of services, which describes the work done by a consulting engineer on a construction project. And part 4 of the guideline talks about fees and remuneration. So that is very important to have this basic understanding of these 4 parts of the document, 4 distinctly different parts of the document. And even more important than that is to understand that the EXA guideline is not a professional services contract on its own. Over many, many years, so often I've seen, I was going to call them contracts, but they're not contracts, but I've seen documents written by clients and consulting engineers saying along the lines like, you're appointed for this project as the consulting engineer, and your appointment is in terms of the EXA guideline. Well, that's actually quite a meaningless statement. The EXA guideline is only part of a proper, typical professional services contract. And again, this is so important to understand it that I've actually given you the slide here. So typically, any procurement document in the construction industry should have these parts if we're following more or less the CIDB prescripts. So you should have a tender section and a form of tender. Then you should have what the contract data, which would be your standard form of professional services contract, which could be CIDB, it could be the CISA form of agreement, it could be FIDIC, or NEC, or any other typical professional services contract, form of contract, sorry. And then we have the pricing data, which is the EXA guideline fees, the fee section. As I showed you on the previous slide, that would be part 4 of the EXA document, or clause 4. And then the other part of the standard or your typical professional services contract would be a scope of services, which describes the work that the consulting engineer is meant to do, and that is part or clause 3 of the EXA guideline. And then finally, you would have a scope of the construction work as another part of the document. So just to be absolutely clear, everybody, that the EXA guideline is just part of your overall document. Okay, I'm going to come back to this concept of the scope of services and scope of work just now, because that also often creates confusion. If we now look at the actual document, and again, it's so important to read the whole document and not just to go to the back page and look at the fees. You need to have a proper understanding of what's in the document. And the preamble and definitions section sort of set the scene. First of all, clause 1 talks about various things in general terms, but I think the two important points are, first of all, that in terms of the Engineering Professions Act, EXA is under obligation to review and publish the fees guidelines annually. That they're required to do that. The Engineering Professions Act and the Council for the Built Environment Act require all the built environment professions to review and publish fee guidelines annually. And then, perhaps most important of all, for clients, is that this guideline is not prescriptive. It is there as a guideline and nothing more. It's there to assist a client and a consulting engineer in getting to agreement on both the fees and the scope of the services that are to be done. Terribly important, okay? But I might just hasten to add that obviously, once you've come to that agreement and you've decided you're going to use the guideline and it's incorporated into your professional services agreement, then that document is binding. That is then part of your contract. Okay, let's move on. Definitions. They're in clause 1.2. All the definitions are important, but just a couple of things to take particular note of in the 2025 document. There's a new definition for authority. There was never a definition for authority, and that was a bit vague previously. That's been clarified. You must note the difference between building projects and engineering projects. And I think the definitions are quite clear and explain this properly. You've just got to read them carefully. Cost of the works is something that is important. What is the basis on which fees are the value on which fees are determined when they're on a percentage basis, and that is defined very carefully in the definitions of the guideline. The 2025 document has a new definition or a very expanded definition for electronic and mechatronic engineering services, because there was a lot of confusion between as to what exactly is meant by electronic engineering services, and that has been clarified. You need to understand, and it's all definitions are there, the difference between a lead consulting engineer, which is the leader of a joint venture, a principal consultant, essentially that's project manager, and the principal agent, which is the agent appointed by the client to administer the construction contract. Those definitions are all in there and very clear. And then, most importantly, do understand the difference between the scope of work and the scope of services. The scope of work is, and the definitions are there, but the scope of work is the objective of the project. In other words, if the project is to build a water treatment works, then the water treatment works, the actual building and the works is the scope of work. The scope of services describes what the consulting engineer has to do. And that's quite often misunderstood. So make sure you read the definitions and understand that difference between the two. Moving on, the general provisions. Another important little item is clause 2 on page 12. What happens if a new guideline or a new version of the guideline is published halfway through a project? Well, this clarifies that the provisions of the previous guidelines, and it might not just be one, it might be depending on the duration of a project, they could be updated several times during the course of the project. So the provisions of previous board notices still apply in respect of a project stage that has not yet been completed. So let's just say, for example, you're busy on a project as the consulting engineer, and halfway through stage 3, a new guideline is published. What then must apply is that the provisions, and this applies to the fee calculations as well, still apply to the old one, still applies to stages 1 to 3, because you're halfway through stage 3. It doesn't change halfway through. And then stages 4, 5, and 6 will be calculated, and the provisions of the new guideline will apply to those stages. So that's just an important item in clause 1.2. Then moving on and getting into clause 3, which is the guideline scope of services, as I explained when we looked at the context. And 3.1 explains what is now headed Specialist Engineering Services and Studies and Feasibility Studies. And I may say that more and more, as technology advances and work becomes more specialized, we are finding that you cannot simply put the old in you can't put some of these specialist engineering services into the traditional, what I call core engineering disciplines of civil, structural, mechanical, and electrical. So things like fire engineering, which was one of my specialities, you really cannot describe the work that the engineer has to do simply using the traditional scope of services. And likewise, you can't describe or you can't calculate the fees simply on a percentage basis. It just does not work. So clause 3 of the guideline describes what we now call specialist engineering services and studies and feasibility studies. And very, very important, these are not part of the normal work that a consulting engineer does. If a client decides they want to build a bridge over the freeway, somebody has to have a look at that and decide whether, or do an investigation to determine whether that project is going to be feasible. So you need to do it, and a well-informed and a well-capacitated client will be able to do it in-house. But most clients will need to appoint an engineer to do that feasibility study for them. And the same applies to buildings and any other project you can come across in the whole of the construction industry. There needs to be a feasibility study, and that is not part of the normal work done by the consulting engineer or any of the other professionals. It is a study on its own, and that's what clause 3 seeks to do, to actually make it clear that feasibility studies are separate from the normal services of the consulting engineer. And obviously, the nature of the work is such that normal percentage fees can't apply, and the remuneration normally would be on a time and cost basis. Okay? So the most important that, and it really is often misunderstood that clients sort of expect their consultants, and I say consultants because it includes all the built environment professionals, or do their feasibility studies just as part of their normal services. That's not what's intended with the EXA guideline. It's separate. Moving on, we now get into clause 3.2, which describes the normal services done by the consulting engineer. And first of all, the very first item is to note that normal services do not include feasibility studies. The normal services assume that the feasibility study has already been done by the client, either in-house by himself or by appointing somebody to carry out that feasibility study. And of course, there's no reason why the person who did the feasibility study, or the consulting engineer or other built environment professional, could equally carry on with the normal services. It doesn't have to be a different firm, it can be the same firm, but it should be a separate appointment and paid for separately. Okay, just a point of clarification. A principal consultant, that's the so-called project management role, and principal agent services are deemed to be part of the normal services unless specifically agreed in writing. So just remember that. If I can give a quick, simple example, let's say a client decides to build a water treatment works, and the client appoints a consulting engineer to carry out that work. And that happens very often. You get the larger multidisciplinary firms can easily do all the services. I mean, obviously, a water treatment works includes civil work, structural work, mechanical and electrical. And very often a single firm can do all of that. And unless it's a particularly complex and large project, the EXA guideline assumes that the work done as a principal consultant and principal agent simply forms part of the work. On the other hand, the client may decide for any reason, for various reasons, to appoint a team of different firms to do the work. You might appoint a consulting engineer, a civil engineer, a different firm for structures, a different firm for mechanical, and the same for electrical. Now suddenly you've got a whole team of different firms and people. You've got a whole lot more coordination and working between the firms, and that is when one of those firms needs to be appointed as principal consultant and or principal agent and be paid for doing that additional service. So just be aware of that. The next item in the introduction in 321 is that financial administration is deemed to be part of the normal services, excepting in the case of civil and structural engineering for building services and where the works is part of the builder's work. And that, for example, plumbing, where the work is part of the builder's work. And basically what it all boils down to is that under those circumstances, the financial administration is done by the quantity surveyor. Otherwise, financial administration is deemed to be part of your normal services. And then finally, just an item is that health and safety agent work is not part of the engineering scope, and it's been deleted from the 2025 guideline. So you won't see any reference to OHS work in the guideline because it's not part of the engineering scope. And in actual fact, the engineer may not act as both consulting engineer and OHS agent at the same time. Okay. Then clause 3.2 is actually several pages. It goes from 3.2.2 to 3.2.7, and it describes the various stages of a typical engineering project, and from stage 1 through to stage 6. I think we're all familiar with those. There's not a great deal of difference. There's some minor changes to the wording in the 2025 document, but they're fairly minor, excepting there are a couple of things that I must highlight. And the first one is that that you will notice that in each stage it talks about attendance at meetings, and it states fortnightly. So unless it's agreed otherwise, you are only expected to attend fortnightly meetings. And the reason for that is that so often engineers and other professionals find themselves attending endless meetings to the extent that they're unable to do their design work. So attendance on a fortnightly basis is the default unless it's specifically agreed otherwise. And then the other thing is, in order to be clear on what forms financial administration services, you will find that they in the way they laid out in the stages, they are listed separately from the what I'd call the engineering services, the technical services. So that's just to make it clear. And then another very, very important item or a change in the 2025 document is that in clause 3.2.6, it basically says that unless otherwise agreed, the default on construction monitoring is level 1 construction monitoring. So that wasn't clear in the 2021 document. It was left up to agreement between the client and the consulting engineer. But in this version of the document, it's actually the default is level 1 unless otherwise agreed. And we'll talk a little bit about that just now. Sorry, I went too far. Then clause 3.3 deals with additional services. What are additional services? They are services which are not included as part of the normal scope of services. And I would say that it's absolutely essential, it should be compulsory that every client and every consulting engineer reads these additional services, clause 3.3, to be absolutely clear on what work is not included. Another way of looking at it is to look at the exclusions. Just like your insurance policy, if you look in your insurance policy, there's a whole section dealing with exclusions. Well, that's what the additional services are doing in the EXA guideline. These have not changed dramatically, but there are now a list of 26 miscellaneous additional services. I think there are quite a few added in towards the end. Probably the most important one, which we experience all the time, is clause 3.3.1, subclause 14, which talks about what happens if there's a failure by the contractor or others to perform. And it's important to understand that or others could include other professionals, or it could include the client. For a good example is what happens when there's non-payment on a project and projects are delayed because of that, and it results in an awful lot of additional work by the consulting engineer and time wasted and fruitless expenditure, and the consulting engineer must be remunerated for that or compensated for that. And subclause 14 provides a lot more detail to basically to protect the consulting engineer under these circumstances where projects are delayed or where projects go wrong. A couple of other ones that are added in is condition assessment of existing facilities, and then there's quite an explanation about electronic and mechatronic services, explaining that they are not deemed to be part of the normal services. And the only reason such an emphasis is placed on this is because traditionally there's been was a clause or a fee section in the percentage fee scales for electronic work, and that wasn't always applied correctly. So there's a good explanation of that. The same explanation could apply equally to other specialist engineering. It's not a part of the normal services. Then clause 3.3.2, construction monitoring, again, absolutely essential that clients and consulting engineers both read this because it describes the different levels of construction monitoring. There's an introduction which particularly highlights the risk that a client faces if they do not allow for adequate construction monitoring. And I'm talking here about site monitoring site staff. It describes level 1 as being fortnightly site visits with some additional visits at critical times, which always happens. And these vary according to the nature of the work being done. So structural engineers need to inspect slabs before they cast. Mechanical, electrical engineers need to inspect the works at various times. Civil engineers, on the other hand, almost have to constantly, continuously monitor the works because so much gets covered up. And the big thing is that level 1, once again, is just fortnightly visits, and it is really only applied to basic, simple projects. It does not apply to it should not apply to projects, and this is described in clause 3.3.2. You will find a detailed note under the description of level 1 construction monitoring. And really, clients need to understand that. Consulting engineers need to understand it. Otherwise, you can be held responsible for for supposedly doing work that you're not being paid for. And it really is a problem. So read that carefully. The same with level 2 and level 3. They haven't changed from previous versions, but just always have a clear understanding of what is meant there. Moving on, other parts of clause 3.3. There's not really any change here. Quality assurance system, if a client has a specific quality assurance system that he wants applied to a project, that is an additional service. The lead consulting engineer, that hasn't changed. Engineering management services, it is just to understand that is basically what a principal consultant is. And then, of course, dispute resolution, litigation, and so on. That's an additional service. Remembering, of course, that part of your normal services is to handle normal contractual claims that are submitted. That's part of your normal services. It's only when it turns into a formal dispute, at that point, if the consulting engineer has to be involved, it is an additional service that must be paid for. And then finally, if you act as the principal agent of the client. All of these items on this slide have not changed from previous versions. They're the same, but they need to be understood. Right, now, how are we doing for time? I think we're doing okay. We move now on to the second part, or the second main part of the document, which is clause 4, dealing with guideline fees. And probably in the whole document, the most important part of the document to have an absolute thorough understanding of is clause 4.1, which deals with general aspects of the fee calculation. Don't just go back and to the back of the document and look at the fee tables. You need to really understand these general clauses, and so does the client. And if you're the consulting engineer, you need to make sure the client understands them, because this is where there can be a lot of argument. So first of all, 412 is risk assessment. Points out that, and these, by the way, are, I think, all new. Most of them are new to the 2025 document. The risk assessment, the client needs to assess the risk of appointing a consulting engineer based on price alone. That sounds obvious, but it's important to point that out to the client. The client is taking the risk if he appoints a consulting engineer purely on price, and when he just wants the lowest price. The same applies to managing the risk and appointments based on fee discounts are not recommended, and that is highlighted and explained in clause 4.1.3. 4.1.4 describes various factors which may influence the magnitude of the fee. General factors, project complexity, project size, and so on and so forth. It's just general items which, particularly for uninformed clients or clients who are not used to the building industry, to get an understanding that fees are not determined simply as a percentage or as a discount or anything like that. There are factors that influence the magnitude of the fee. And then the really important clause is 4.1.5. And I could probably spend a couple of hours dealing just with that clause because it has got so much detail in it, explaining how the fee gets adjusted according to specific um, 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 situations in a project. So, for example, what happens in the case of existing buildings, alterations to existing buildings? What happens where there's duplication of buildings? Most importantly, what happens where the engineer's appointment is partial? He doesn't take on full responsibility for a service. And the the easiest one that I always explain here is the structural engineer on a building where perhaps one engineer is appointed to design the substructure, the foundations, and possibly the concrete columns. Another engineer is appointed to design the steel structure, and then a third engineer is appointed, sorry, to design the roof structure. And that does happen. That happens quite often. And you've got the question there of split responsibilities, who gets paid what, and clause 4.1.5 goes quite a long way to explaining how to deal with those situations. There's an awful lot in that. It's clause 4.1.5, I think, is several pages long, and you really, really need to understand what's in that clause. And then finally, clause 4.1.6 has been quite substantially revised, and it talks about the timing of fee claims. Historically, fees were claimed at the end of each stage of a project. But as projects get larger and more complex and the project duration is longer, that really doesn't work. And so it's the default now is in the 2025 document is that fees can be claimed monthly unless otherwise agreed. So that's important. That's the default for claiming fees. Then we get to the actual fee percentages, the percentage-based fees, where the fees are based on the cost of the work. Once again, read the introduction carefully. And the introduction now provides, in the 25 document, provides several worked examples of fee calculations to explain to the consulting engineer and to clients how do you use the percentage fee tables. And then we run through all the various fee tables and the fee calculations from clause 4.2.2 to 4.2.8. So it's all the core disciplines: civil, structural, mechanical, and electrical. And there's the differentiation between building projects and engineering projects. And to understand that, that's when it's good to go back to the definitions and to read what is meant by a building project and what is meant by an engineering project. The next slide, I'm actually going to show you how to use the fee tables, but just before that, 4.2.9, it talks about the stages of a project and where services are provided partially or in stages where the consulting engineer is not appointed to do all the stages. It's not something that one would recommend, but unfortunately it does happen, and sometimes that is necessary. But the client then faces a large or substantial financial penalty if their consultants are only employed to do partial stages. And then 4.2.10 deals with postponement, cancellation, or abandonment of a project. And it's a question that regularly gets asked by clients and consulting engineers. My project has been cancelled. How do I calculate the surcharge or the cancellation fee? 4.2.10 explains it. And the bottom line is that where a project is cancelled or postponed halfway through, the client pays for all the stages of work that have been done up to that point, plus a penalty or a surcharge of 10% of the full project value has to be paid. It's an unpopular clause with clients, but having a project cancelled or postponed is incredibly disruptive to a consulting engineer. Consulting engineers have to plan projects, and when you get appointed for a project, a big project or small project, you assign staff to that project, you assign expensive staff, they're highly skilled people, you've set them aside and you've dedicated them to that project. You may have turned other work away because you know you've got that project, and then suddenly halfway through it's cancelled. The consulting engineer still has to pay their staff, they still have to carry on, they get involved in very, very significant cost to themselves when a project is cancelled, and it's only right that those costs need to be passed on to the client. Okay, looking now at the calculation of the percentage fee, I'm sure that everyone present knows how this works. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but essentially, sorry, I just want to get my pointer going. If you have a project, and let's just assume it's a straightforward rural road project, the value of the project is 24 million rand, and then the procedure to calculate that fee would be, first of all, you determine where does that project value fit. It fits between 21 and 52 million, and therefore this is the row that's applicable. So the primary fee is 2.488 million, and the secondary fee is 9% on the value by which the project value exceeds the basic value. So in other words, in this case, it's 9% of the difference between 24 million and 21 million. And that gives you your 9%. You add that to your primary fee, and that gives you your basic fee, which is explained here, of 2.758 million. And then in this particular example, it's a simple rural road project. So it's not shown here, but you'll be familiar with the fact that you then go to table 2A, which provides a list of complexity factors according to different project situations. And for a simple rural road, there's a complexity factor of 0.85 because it's a simple project to run, and that gives you your resultant fee, which you can either express it as a lump sum or you can express it as a new percentage. So that's the basic workings of the fee tables. It's quite well explained in the introduction, where there are worked examples. If you're unclear, you can go through those. Moving on, the next part of the document is pretty much the same as it's been for many years. There's no real change. The basis for fees for additional services, generally on a time and cost basis. 431 explains that. 432 explains how to calculate the fee for site staff, and that depends on various situations. No change there. The same with lead consulting engineer. That's the leader of a joint venture. And remember that the additional fee only applies where the joint venture has been specified by the client. If you decide that you want to go in on a project in a joint venture between yourself or your firm and another or other firms, that is your issue. And you don't get an additional fee for it. But if the client says, I want this project to be run using a joint venture system, then the whoever is selected as the lead engineer gets an additional fee. Engineering management services, no change. There are fee tables for that. And principal agent was also no change, 1% of the total cost of the works. Okay. We're getting towards the end now. Time-based fees, and I'm just about running over, but another couple of minutes and I'll be finished. Time-based fees, fairly straightforward and no real change here. The EXA guideline describes the category of person to whom the time-based fee is applied, and there's the category A, B, C, and D. And then what is introduced in the 2025 document is that, the category A, B, and C then requires you to calculate the hourly rate based on the total annual cost of remuneration of the person concerned. And the problem which clients often have is that who knows whether the total annual cost of remuneration is a fair price or not. You're relying on the consulting engineer's word, even if you have the rate audited, it doesn't mean that it's a fair rate. So, and that's often caused arguments. So EXA has suggested that in that case, you can base your hourly rates on the system described by the Department of Public Service and Administration. And as a matter of interest, the method described by the Department of Public Service and Administration is really set out in detail in a guideline for, I'm not sure of the exact wording of the title, but a guideline for consultants, appointment of consultants. And this is published by the Department of Public Service and Administration. And that document is available on their website. And I've actually asked Oliver to put it into the chat, or he's going to make it available to you, the links to that. Are there any questions on the website? I didn't mean to. And there's an additional document that goes with it.
No, Craig,
that
listen,
is that
you're encroaching on my
annually
space now.
publish
I'm
actual
supposed to be
rates
asking that question.
used in the public service or by the public service, and that is a separate document. That link is also available to anyone. So those are published by the Department of Public Service. They are, what's the right word? Formal, publicly available rates, and EXA recommends that they can be used where you don't know the total annual cost of employment. Clause 4.4.4 of the document of the guideline shows you how to calculate the annual cost of employment. We're nearly there. Clause 4.5, the final pages of the document, describes how expenses and costs may be recovered. There's no change for previous versions. Note that a markup of 10% is usually added for administrative costs. So you base your expenses or costs on the cost to the company, plus 10% markup for admin. Ladies and gentlemen, I've come to the end of my presentation. Certainly, I think the exit fee guideline provides a convenient method to describe and specify the services to be performed by a consulting engineer, and it also provides guidelines for determining the fees to be paid. And I'll just go back to the very beginning and remind you that the EXA guideline is not prescriptive. It is there as a guideline. It is there as a basis for negotiation between a client and a consulting engineer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. It was an incredible presentation, and certainly has been one that I've enjoyed. Obviously, being aware of these guidelines for a number of years, and looking at the 2021 as well as these ones, it's always nice to hear someone just kind of talk a bit of clarity into them. And so we do have some questions. So are we going to move into questions and answers? If I can just request that if you do have any questions, please feel free to continue to post them, and we'll allow Craig an opportunity to answer them. Craig, I'm going to start off with an interesting one, and it's not going kind of like conforming to the first question that was asked, but maybe this is one which I think maybe you've kind of answered already based on what you've just said, that it's a guideline. But one of the presenters, one of the what do you call it, attendees said, yeah, please assist in explaining 4.1.2 and 4.1.3, which was obviously the risks to government, parastatal, and municipal clients. And then a little bit later, he mentions there, as well as to national treasury. And I must admit, when you were just busy talking about those risks, I also kind of question why is this not something that I'm seeing in tenders? You know, why are we still working on the cheapest value and you know, the highest discount when we have these guidelines? I'm going to hand it to you. Nice one to start off the question and answers.
That's really giving me a tricky question to answer. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. The EXA guideline, I think, and I'm talking personally now, I'm not giving any sort of formal response, but the EXA guideline has to fit into government procurement regulations and national treasury regulations, and for that reason, competitive tendering is an essential feature of any procurement system. And unfortunately, what has happened in South Africa, specifically with professional fees, is that the fee tables that are published by not just by the engineers, but by all the professionals, the architects, QSs, and everyone else, has become to be regarded as a maximum fee, and you tender a discount. And the worst part of it is that I think we as professionals have then behaved irresponsibly, and we take our fees and we say, oh, well, I better give a discount of 20%, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe I better make it 21% or 22%. And we just do those discounts without any thought to what we are actually doing to the cost structure of our project. So I think personally that in future, the correct way to do this is going to be to calculate our fees properly from basic principles, where you work on a man-hour schedule, you calculate what's needed, you put rates to it, cost rates, and you add your costs of your overheads, you're running your firm, your computers, your software, and everything else, and you do it on a proper cost basis. Unfortunately, the fee percentage basis have become just an arbitrary thing. What I would say, and what I have seen a lot on public sector tenders, is they are advertised that the fees must be based on the published fees with a discount applied, but the maximum discount, and I've seen various things. I've seen 10% very often, I've seen 5%, I've seen even 20%. But that to me is is at least a step better than a blind discount. Unfortunately, of course, becomes a bit of a farce, because then what happens is that everyone just applies the 10% discount, and the client is left with a whole lot of tenders, all of the same value. So there isn't an easy answer. I think it's something that is going to develop in the country over time. But that is why I think those clauses 4.1.1 and 2 and 3 are there to try and use as a not as an argument, but as a pointer to clients. Don't just base your procurement on price alone. You're shooting yourself in the foot. I haven't answered the question, but I don't think there is an answer. I don't think there is an answer to that
I,
question.
I certainly agree with that statement. I don't think there is an answer. And one of the questions which kind of fits in with what you just said, and you know, it says here, thanks, Craig, much appreciated. Which clients are obliged to use these guidelines? But I think you've already answered that in that they are guidelines, so it's not really anyone's obliged. But maybe if you can just elaborate on that.
No, nobody's, as far as I know, I'm not a procurement expert, but as far as I know, nobody's obliged to use them. They can adopt any other system. Basically, private sector can do what they like. Public sector should be following the CIDB prescripts. The CIDB, I don't think specifies the EXA guideline at all, but it does specify certain forms of professional services contract. And really, the EXA guideline is what it says here on this concluding slide. It's just a convenient method. It's a convenient standard to use, but it's, as far as I know, it's not prescribed for use by anybody, and nobody's obliged to use it.
Right. Thanks, Craig. Okay, we're going to move into some more specific questions and not dealing with the document in its totalness. If financial administration for plumbing, in brackets, wet services, did not form part of normal services, why is there a 0.85 factor to be applied to the wet services fee calculation when QS does financial administration on projects?
Okay, I'm going to speak from memory. I don't want to waste time and start going back to the document, but plumbing has always, in my best of my memory, has always had a factor applied to it. Maybe I better go to that clause just to clarify my own thinking. Uh,
So, Craig,
yeah,
while you're doing that, I see a number of people are busy writing questions into the chat. Please note I am monitoring it, and we will get to them, but we're going to focus on the questions and the Q&A first. Sorry, Craig, over to you.
Yeah, okay. So there's always been a factor of 1.25 on plumbing work, simply because I think, I mean, this really goes back probably 30 years or more, but it comes from the fact that plumbing work is complex in relation, I'm talking about the design and supervision, is complex in relation to the value of the work, the cost of the works, and that is why that factor was applied. Then there is, in fact, you will find it in somewhere in 4.1.5, I believe. it explains that where financial services are not part of the contract, there is a further factor applied of, and I think it might be 0.85. So your plumbing has a factor of 1.25 and 0.85. I won't swear to that. I would have to go back and check properly, but off the top of my head, I think that's how it works. Once again, just a sort of a pointer as to why it's so important to read through 4.1.5 carefully. I don't know if that answers the question.
Craig, let's see. It's sadly by an anonymous attendee. So, anonymous attendee, if you are happy with that answer to the question, please feel free to put a thumbs up. I'm going to move on to another one, which happens to also be an anonymous attendee. It says clause 3.3.1 in brackets 14. Does this mean PSP is entitled to additional fees for all EOTs? Does, and they put it in commas here, awards, construction period refer to the initial construction period, excluding any awards, EOTs, awarded EOTs? Sure, Craig,
Sorry,
I hope you're getting that one. Do you want me to repeat that?
I just didn't quite hear the last part of the question.
Okay, so it says clause 3.3.1 brackets 14. Does this mean PSP is entitled to additional fees for all EOTs? Does award construction period refer to the initial construction period, excluding any awarded EOTs?
Look, I'm talking now my personal interpretation of the document. My interpretation would be that if a construction program is agreed, and the project proceeds, and there is then a substantial, and I say that because I don't think anyone should be petty, but if there's a substantial, significant delay in the project for any reason, and if that's not caused by the PSP themselves, then the PSP would be entitled to claim an additional fee in terms of clause 331.14.
All right, thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. I'm going to move straight on to another one. Why are fire safety services, rational fire design, not specifically included under additional services under 3.3.1? Clients do not want to pay additional fees for the services.
Okay, that one is close to my heart.
I thought it might be.
Yeah. My answer to that is that fire engineering is a specialist service. Fire engineering, you cannot calculate the fee based on a percentage of the project. And I mean, this is a whole debate on its own, and I'd love to talk about it at length sometime. But the fee is normally calculated on a time and cost basis for the work that the fire engineer would do. So I would regard that as a specialist service. In actual fact, the same applies to electronic and mechatronic services. It's not an additional service. It's a specialist service. And there are actually other engineering disciplines, geotechnical work, for example, environmental engineering, various items. Those are specialist services, and we're going to see that list growing in the future as work becomes more specialized. So yeah, I don't know if that answers, but that's the best I can do.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. All right, I'm moving on to another one from Yanni Duplessis. The definition of electronic engineering words reads, electronic and mechatronic engineering services mean services related to programming, coding, and design of complex control and instrumentation installation and purpose design electronic circuitry and equipment, in brackets low voltage less than 48 volts. It may also include detailing the termination, signals, and interconnection of electronic components as distinct from priority design and commercially available electronic equipment and systems, and conventional electric, high voltage, medium voltage, and low voltage system and related reticulation. I'm not too sure if there's a question there. That was quite a tongue twister, all those words. The definition of electronic engineering work reads.
That sounded like a repeat of the definition in the EXA
Yeah,
guideline.
that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, sorry. Maybe this is where the question come in. Would building access control, the network installation, and video surveillance design be considered electronic engineering services? Sorry, I think that may be the question relating to that definition.
Yeah, look, I think it depends entirely on what the engineer is doing. If the engineer is taking, and that's where it comes back to the wording of the definition, which talks about proprietary systems. Now, I'm a simple old mechanical engineer, but so perhaps and my example would be a fire detection system where you buy a standard electronic panel and you add a number of fire detectors and you show that on a drawing and you check the installation. You haven't designed the electronic system. It's a proprietary system. So I would say the same applies. What was that, a building management system you talked about?
Yeah, they said, would building access control,
Oh,
network
yes. Yeah.
installation, and video surveillance design be considered electronic engineering services?
It depends what the engineer does. If the engineer is really designing the electronic system, then yes, it is an electronic, but very often that would be, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, it's not official, that wouldn't be electronic. That would be covered by the standard fee. Or you could calculate it on a time and cost basis. Sometimes those systems, there is an awful lot of work in the commissioning stage of a project. So maybe the percentage fees don't apply. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Craig. That was a good question. Are EXA and CISA aware that there are errors in the primary fee values in all tables for building projects?
That's easy. Yes. EXA is certainly aware of that, and CISA. And I understand that the next version of the EXA document is going to address those. They were basic, straightforward errors. EXA, I have actually seen where they have suggested to clients and consulting engineers that because the document, the guideline is just a guideline, the client and the consulting engineer can decide you either apply the guideline simply as is, taking it at face value, or you can correct the obvious errors. That's up to you. That's EXA's interim thing, but it certainly will, as far as I know, be addressed in the new guideline, which should be published before the end of this year.
All right, lovely. Thanks, Craig. And I think all our engineers out there will be quite excited to see that. Here's one from Greg Cummings. Firstly, he starts off by going, thanks, Craig, for an insightful presentation. And his question is said, recently it has become the norm to curtail the design responsibilities. Let me start that again. Recently, it has become the norm to curtail the designer's responsibilities to stage 4 and then appoint a new consulting engineer for stages 5 and 6. In complex projects, and specifically when the project is an augmentation of existing infrastructure, not everything is now known when the design is completed. Do you have any insight on the designer's obligation during the construction stages to resolve these unknowns? Likewise, there may be testing and optimization required during stage 5 if the project is a treatment plant. Would the new consultant be responsible for this element of the work in terms of 3.2.6?
Very interesting question. it's not really something that's covered or should be covered in the EXA guideline. But actually, Oliver, that is our very latest practice note. I think it was 106 or 107 was the
Correct,
latest one.
107.
Yeah, that deals with that situation, and it specifically deals with the engineer's responsibility. And I think, Greg, you should go and read the national building regulations, because the bottom line is that the engineer who takes over the work is responsible for the design as well. The engineer who takes over the design responsibility. And that's again, that happens to be my personal view, but I was involved in writing the latest practice note, which deals with that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Craig. So yeah, Greg, if you want to email me at Oliver at cisa.co.za, I can certainly provide you with direction to that latest practice notes. Okay, so where are we? Here's one from Craig. Thanks, Craig. Much appreciated. Oh, which clients are obliged to use these guidelines? Okay, we've dealt with that already. Moving down. Hi, Craig. Could you please clarify the EXA 2025 guidelines regarding stage 5 remuneration, where a construction contract is extended through no fault of the consulting engineer? Should the stage 5 fee be based on the contractor's percentage progress, or should it be based on the time elapsed, i.e. the extended contract duration? Clause 3.3.1, 14A seems to suggest that the adjustment should be linked to the extended contract period. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, look, my interpretation of that clause, and I haven't got it in front of me right now, but that what the engineer should be compensated or remunerated for the additional costs. So the additional costs would be additional time spent in either wasted time or sorting out the problem, and you're entitled to costs for that. I don't quite think it would normally suddenly, and in any event, you would be, as far as I know, you would be entitled to, if you're using the guideline, you're entitled to the final cost of the works at the end of the fee. Sorry, I'm talking in circles here, but the percentage fee would be based on the final cost of the works, which would include any additional costs as a result of the additional time. But in addition to that, if the consulting engineer finds that he or she has had to do additional work because of that delay, there's a further additional fee involved. Look, this question of additional fees because of contractor non-performance or contract delays is messy. It is always messy, and it's not an easy one to deal with. The guideline is there intended, I think, to assist you in reaching an equitable fee at the end. That's basically what it is. So, but yet there's not an easy one-off answer to that question. Sorry.
All right, thanks, Craig. Here's one from Ken Naka. It says, if the terms of contract define a board notice for engineering appointment, does it not apply to all stages of the project, even if it is amended or revised?
Sorry, just repeat that. If what? If
the terms of contract
yes.
define a board notice for engineering appointment, does it not apply to all stages of the project, or if it is amended or revised?
No, my legal and understanding and my legal knowledge is limited, but the board notice actually states that the old document is repealed. In other words, the old document doesn't exist anymore as of that date. But it realizes that that is almost an impossible situation. So it does say the old board notice still applies to the stages of a project that are not yet completed. but the new board notice definitely applies to all further stages. I think you would have to ask somebody, a lawyer, to interpret that properly, but I'm pretty sure that is what is intended.
Yeah, he did say, what does CISA's agreement say about that? I think what we must do is, Chen, maybe if you could email me, and we can certainly look at getting some of our legal guys on that to give you
Yeah.
some form of better answer there. But thanks, Craig. It's
Yeah.
you did well
Yeah.
there. Um,
Yeah, the CISA form of agreement definitely says that if any act or statute changes during the course of the project, that, I don't know the wording again, but that has to be taken into account. I mean, it has to be. It's legal. It's law of the
yeah.
country. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Craig. What is your perception of price gouging in the current engineering environment, and how has this been addressed by bodies such as CISA, EXA, etc.? Sure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what is meant by the question, but certainly I don't know what you mean by that, by price gouging and how it applies to engineering services. But if you mean that engineers take advantage of the client to squeeze every cent out of the project, I would say this isn't CISA's view, it's my view. I think that is not the way engineers should behave ethically. You should behave ethically in accordance with your professional standards and do what you meant to do in a fair manner to everybody. I don't know. I don't think there's an answer to that. And I don't fully understand what price gouging would be as applied to engineering services. Uh, I'd be happy to address that separately.
Okay. All right. So you feel free to send that question to us, and we can look at
Yeah, with
finding an
pleasure.
answer for you.
Yeah.
I think the price gouging is something I'm stuck on at the moment. Okay, next one, we've got two comments. For structural engineering, bending schedules are normally issued as part of stage 5. State departments, particularly where NEC contracts are used, require that bending schedules be provided at tender stage. This impacts on percentage applicable to each stage. There is also a risk that the contractor is entitled to order the steel upfront, resulting in waste when changes are required. I don't know if there's a question there. Well, it did say comments, and then there is a tendency for state departments to appoint stage by stage, which puts the consultant at risk, as the appointment may be cancelled at any stage without the 10% cancellation fee being applied. I don't know if you want to add anything to those comments.
No, not really. I think the first one is that if the once again, the guidelines not prescriptive. So if the client requires the bending schedules at an earlier stage, then perhaps the stage fees need to be adjusted accordingly. As to appointments in stages, and again, if the guideline applies and the guideline is part of the contract, then you would be entitled to a surcharge for each stage. Well, it depends on the timing and so on. One would
Yeah.
have to really look at the terms of the contract.
Okay. This is quite an interesting one. It says, with the recent issues that have been experienced in the construction industry with regards to collapsed buildings and poor engineering oversight, the Minister for Public Work and Infrastructure is taking a firm stance on improving within the construction industry. My question to you is, has CISA engaged with the relevant departments, provincial or national, to inform them that prescribed rates exist and how these have been determined, and that tenders going out into the public should take these prescribed rates into consideration when budgeting for the infrastructure projects?
Yeah, well, first of all, just remember they're not prescribed rates, they're recommended or guideline rates. But secondly, I personally can't answer the question as to how CSIS got involved. I think um, there are so many aspects to these recent building collapses. One of my other interests is the national building regulations and the way they are applied and administered. Um, and yeah, I think sadly a lot of what has happened is the consequences of various things not being done correctly in the country,
Yeah,
and I suppose it's a learning curve. But
yeah.
I think that is a question and a comment, Oliver, that we could take back to CISA, and actually perhaps CISA can comment somehow on that.
Yeah. So Craig, I was letting you respond first, but we actually are in some ways we're addressing that and certainly putting our viewpoint forward in the CE news or the CISA news that's coming out on the end of the month, which we actually talking to these concerns, these issues that are coming up. I mean, we've just recently had the wall collapse in Inanda in Durban, where 8 people were trapped under material that was a retaining wall. Um, and there was another one where Linwood here in Pretoria, a gentleman after the rugby at Loftus fell into a hole in the construction on Linwood. And so it definitely, we're seeing more and more of this where there just seems to be safety issues are not taken, and people are obviously suffering as a result. So CISA is putting out something in the C News at the end of the month, and certainly I think we're going to take it further and just try and yeah, I don't really know. I would love to say encourage people to do things right, but we know that ethics doesn't always hold weight. All right. Another one here from Pete van der Berg is please clarify what would the construction of an electrical substation project be? Building project or engineering project? In some cases, you have a large control building that, but also major electrical equipment. All right, interesting question.
Yeah, I think there I would simply go back to the guideline and read the definitions. And certainly, a substation building is a good example of a project that could be either a building project or an engineering project, depending on how the client decides to go about the project. So, for example, if the client were to simply ask an engineer to design a substation, and then ask an electrical engineer to install the switchgear and transformers, that up to my mind would be an engineering project. But if the client were to decide that he's going to treat this building as a proper building project and appoint an architect and a quantity surveyor and a project manager and a whole, in other words, it turns into a whole building project, then that building is no different from building a school or any other building, and it becomes multidisciplinary. It becomes a building project. But if and I know this, my firm is a mechanical electrical, or was when I was still there, mechanical electrical. We do a lot of substations and so on, and very often the substation building would almost be a sort of a subcontract to the electrical contract. Now there, it would be an electrical design. There's no fancy design involved or anything like that. So it would depend on the circumstances.
All right, thanks, Craig.
But sorry, but just, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
use the EXA guideline and the definitions of building and engineering projects to guide you as to which way to go. I think it makes it clear enough.
All right, thanks. So Craig, just I'm obviously conscious of time and also the questions that are going. So I'm going to finish up the questions that are in the Q&A and then just see how we go with questions that have been placed in the chat. But I'm conscious that we kind of said 1:30 we would be finishing. So the last two questions, it says, in case the project is on stage 5 as per scope of services, how do you request the client to compensate for services beyond the prescribed scope of services?
Is that specifically to stage 5?
That's what they have mentioned. Yeah, in case the project is on stage 5 as per scope of services.
Well, I think it's a question of sitting down with the client and negotiating what works best for everybody. Typically, that extension or whatever it is would be additional services, and you would probably negotiate on the basis of time and costs. Yeah, I don't know. Without a proper understanding of the circumstances and exactly what has happened, I'm not quite clear on how to answer that question.
Yeah. Okay, Craig, let's move on. This is quite a nice one. In the general conditions of contract, there is a reference to an employer's agent. Where in the scale of fees does this resource fit in?
Yes, sorry, a what in the GCC?
In the general conditions of contract, there is a reference to an employer's agent.
Oh.
Where in the scale of fees does this resource fit in?
Okay, if it's a pure engineering project, then acting as the employer's agent is part of your normal fee. If it is a multidisciplinary project or there's a whole project team and you are then appointed as the principal agent, that then is an additional fee. So the employer's agent is the same responsibility as a principal agent. I think that's also covered in the definitions, where it depends on the form of contract, whether they talk about employer's agent, or I think some of them, NEC talks about a project manager, GCC talks about employer's agent, JBCC is principal agent. So it depends on the wording, but they all mean the same thing. You are, part of your services is to administer the contract in terms of the contract, acting as the agent. You've got specific responsibilities. It's available on the EXA website. You could also just Google that Gazette number, which I think was on the first slide that I had.
Gazette number 52691.
That's it, 52691.
Yeah. A huge thanks to Craig for sharing his experiences and insights, and thank you to all our delegates for participating and continued support of CISA. There is going to be a satisfaction survey that will appear on your screen at the conclusion of this session, and your feedback is valuable and helps us improve future engagements. Please note that this is registered with EXA, and you can claim 0.15 CPD points for attending this webinar. And in accordance with our attendance record, of course, a record of this webinar will also be made available on our CETV YouTube platform. So please give it a few days, and we will make sure a link goes out to all our participants, and you can then rewatch it. And on that video, we will look at just answering some of the other questions that are found within the chat. So on our behalf, Craig, once again, thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate everything that you did and the time that you took to do this presentation, and all the best for basically the next stage of your guideline fees, as you mentioned. And to everyone else, thank you very much. Have an amazing day and a wonderful weekend. Thank you again for your participation. Goodbye. Right.
I,
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate it. I'm
I'm,
scanning the questions just on the chat,
yeah.
just trying to find ones we
Unfortunately,
can.
these are all fascinating questions, and they all deserve far better answers than I'm giving. But I'm also conscious of time, and
Uh,
I, I'd be love to
um,
sit and debate them for a couple of hours. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the concern of sitting and writing a response would certainly take a lot of time. But I'm just trying to see. Maybe Craig, I think what we can do is let's look at the questions that are in the chat, and maybe we can just do like a little quick write up. We can put it in the video that we will produce at the end of this session. But just because of time and obviously commitment of other things that are taking place within offices and getting back to work, I think maybe we should bring this presentation to an end. If you're happy to do that, Craig.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay, so just to finish up again, just